All right. Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for this update on SAC-RT's comprehensive operational analysis. My name is James Drake. I'm SAC-RT's Senior Manager of Service Planning, and I'm joined tonight first by Peter Soderberg of Nelson Nygaard Consulting Associates, who's our Deputy Project Manager on our COA project. And I'm also joined by our team members here in SAC-RT's planning department, Rowan Brandt and Johnny Kwan. We'll be doing an interactive presentation tonight, a little Q&A. When we get to the Q&A segment, we'll have some directions on how to raise your hand if you're calling in by phone. For those of you on Zoom, you may notice that the chat feature is disabled. That's intentional, but the Q&A feature is operational. So you're welcome to type questions into the Q&A whenever you like. We'll try to take them in the order received. You're also welcome to wait until we get to the Q&A sections and just raise your hand and do your questions by voice if you prefer. With that, before we jump into the main agenda, I'm going to hand the mic over to my boss, our planning director, Mr. Anthony Adams. Anthony, go ahead.
Thank you, James. Good evening, folks, and thank you for making the time to be here with us this evening, especially during dinner. You know, this is an important time for SAC-RT. We're in the midst of a once-in-a-decade planning activity. This is a comprehensive operational analysis that we're undertaking, and this takes a holistic look at not only all the services and programs that we provide, but also the overall structure of how SAC-RT operates. These are things like fare structure, service standards, and even looking at opportunities for public-private partnerships. It's no secret that the current environment for government is one of uncertainty. Many of the cities in this county are trying to fill budget deficits. There's a looming fiscal transit cliff for not only us, but other transit agencies around the nation. The federal government just set a record for the most number of days in a shutdown. This has affected people. It's actually affected SAC-RT. We recently were informed we got $1.7 million and project funded rescinded, in part because of this shutdown. This means that local control and local fiscal sustainability have never been more important. That's why we at SAC-RT are taking this deliberate effort to look and provide a sober and realistic look at our present and future. What can we afford with the funding that we have? Or if there was a new funding source, what services or projects should we prioritize? Now, James is going to go over this, but we're going to be using quantitative analysis as the basis of all our prioritization, things like ridership, project cost, cost per passenger. But there are other factors, qualitative factors, and that's what we want you guys to help us decide on. What type of factors should we look at to help prioritize these projects? Should geographic equity be important? Maybe being in a disadvantaged community. Political support, should that play a factor? We're excited about the possibilities that lay before us as Sacramento grows, and we look forward to informing you about our progress and hearing from you about your opinions on how we can improve this outcome. So thank you for being here today, and we look forward to the conversation.
All right. Thank you, Anthony. So the presentation tonight, we're going to have a brief update on the short-range transit plan element of this project. It's a project with kind of two prongs. First, that SRTP, but then the bulk of the presentation is going to be on our long-range transit plan update, which is what we've been focusing on most of the last few months. We'll wrap up with a little look ahead on the timeline and upcoming meetings. But the last time we were out for public presentations, we gave an overview of the kind of the scope of work for that short-range transit plan update. The key elements of which really are route and schedule changes and fare changes, focused mostly, although certainly not entirely, on Elk Grove, where there's been a lot of focus on just kind of integrating and normalizing the Elk Grove transit service with the rest of SAC-RT. But one of the key parameters for the SRTP update has been budget neutrality. That short-range plan it's really not an expansion plan. It's not a massive cut. It's really just kind of trying to do more with what we have and kind of streamline some of the service we already have. But as far as status goes on that, we are at about 75% completion on that. But over the last couple of months, we have changed our focus a little bit to pick up work on that long-range transit plan. And that's going to be more of a scenario-based thing. Scenario A, scenario B, we don't know exactly what the future will hold, but we want to do some planning and preparation for different environments we could be in. You may have attended over the summer one of several transit idea exchange workshops. We did 5 of these throughout the community in person. And we in the planning department helped facilitate this. This was a lead by our community and government affairs unit. This was really kind of focused on getting public opinion, public preferences, public attitude on transit in general and specific projects. We in the planning department and our consulting team, of course, this is very related to our project. And as co-facilitators in this, we helped put together kind of a fun little Monopoly style game where participants, members of the public, were given $100 of basically Monopoly money and allowed to spend it any way they liked on a number of different projects. And the results are shown on the screen here. We had almost 200 responses between those 5 in-person workshops and 5 other sessions we had in conjunction with our own COA project. And I'll focus on those first 2 projects. Project number 1 for $1, adding late night bus and rail service. And project number 2, upgrading our bus stops and shelters. These are both $1 items, and these are our top scoring items. And really, they're pretty indicative of probably one of the bigger trends we saw in this game, and that really was kind of toward lower cost, lower risk, simpler projects. Although it's not scientific, I'd say we did probably see a bit of a tendency toward that, especially among existing riders as opposed to non-riders. But number 5 on the list, I'll also highlight for $2, student-free fares. That's basically continuation of a program we already have, our Ride Free RT program. And that's another great example of a very simple, low-risk project that's been well received and that got a lot of support in these public meetings. Now, items 3 and 4, for $30, maintain existing service, and for $35, system and facility maintenance. These items basically represent money we'd need to spend out of any new funding source to help the agency get back to fiscal sustainability. In our presentations last time we were out for our COA project, we talked a fair amount about SAC-RT's budget situation, and we're certainly not alone. Transit agencies across the country are facing a lot of budget challenges. We're no different. We like to think we are in maybe a little better shape than our counterparts down in the Bay Area. But one of the purposes of this funding game exercise certainly was to show that in some respects, that $100 of monopoly money, not all of it is necessarily a choice. More than half of it would actually need to be spent just to help avoid either having to cut service, raise fares, or make some major deferments on our replacement of our buses, our light rail vehicles, our light rail system, tracks, ties, ballast, overhead, power supply, that kind of thing. But like I said, the Transit Idea Exchange was really focused more on kind of public opinion. Our focus here in the planning department on the COA is a little more on the technical side, both with budgets and system design. We'll be talking later in this presentation. We'll be looking at maps and where new service could be. We'll be doing 2 scenarios where we talk about potential expansion if SAC-RT were fortunate enough to get a new funding source. But first slide I'm going to show here, the first exhibit on the screen right now, this really covers, this puts a little more detail onto the cost of some of those key projects. And this takes it a little bit from monopoly money to real money. We've shown key projects and broken them down both in terms of their capital cost, which is shown in dark green, as well as their operating cost in light green. To put things into perspective, these projects are shown in terms of billions of dollars, and this is assumed over a 40-year lifetime. So if there was a new sales tax in Sacramento County and the quarter cent of that sales tax went to transit, over 40 years, that would generate $5 billion for transit. So if you took a project such as light rail to Natomas, 4 miles from Richards Boulevard to Arena Boulevard, the cost for that project is about $800 million. And then the operating cost for that over 40 years is about $600 million. That's what that light green area indicates. There's a couple important things to note about projects shown here on the screen. One of those is the dark green area, that construction cost. To be sure, That is the total cost for these projects. Typically, however, with projects like light rail or bus rapid transit, you typically can find matching funds from state, local money, or federal grants. And that's usually the expectation. It's not at all unusual to get more than 50% of those costs covered by other grants. But for the sake of being fiscally conservative, we've just shown the total project cost here. And then likewise, that operating cost in light green, that's usually going to be borne 100% by SAC-RT or by a new funding measure. But it is possible to line up funding partners from our other local jurisdictions. We're going to pause here for our first round of questions, and there may not be any questions just yet, but if there are any questions, I'll go through the housekeeping process on that at this time. Those of you, like I said, who are on Zoom, you can ask questions through Q&A, or you can just raise your hand, and our team here will assist with fielding those questions. And if you're calling in by phone, the procedure is basically to press *9 to raise your hand, and then we would recognize you by your phone number, and then we would go, you would press *6 to unmute yourself to speak. You have any questions already rolling in? You want to read them off, Rowan?
Sure. From Earl Hall, how about growing ridership and factors that can enhance and detract from that? This is posted at 5:37.
Question about best way to grow ridership. That's probably one that would best be taken later. Later in the presentation, we'll get into ridership. Want to do next question?
From Glenn, bus shelters are definitely appreciated this rainy night. What are your plans for installing more?
Great question, Glenn. This chart doesn't show the cost for new bus stops and shelters, but we will be seeing that on one of the upcoming slides.
And then finally from Earl, lately many bus stops get taken over by homeless people that discourage current and potential new riders. Is there a plan to deal with that situation?
So a question about loitering at bus stops and shelters. It's honestly a little outside the scope of this project because we're dealing with pretty big picture budget development here. But it's definitely an issue. I mean, you're not the first person to raise that question. The person really who is lead on that would be Lisa Hines here at SAC-RT, and you're welcome to reach out to our customer advocacy unit on that.
Anthony,
go ahead.
Yeah, this is Anthony. I can address that. So we actually at SAC-RT just approved a $1 million addition to our safety and security budget, which will involve helping to deal with security at our bus stops, on our system, and on the trains as well. So we have recognized it's a major problem, and as such, just recently added an additional $1 million towards that effort. Thanks.
Thanks for jumping in there, Anthony. Any other questions? I think we'll jump to the next slide then. So next we'll be presenting two different scenarios for potential long-range plan. There'll be a 1/4 cent sales tax scenario and a 1/2 cent sales tax scenario. And at this stage of our project, our main goal was to illustrate what we can afford, kind of a budget level exercise, a level of service level exercise. We have made some decisions on what to show in this first draft, but we want to qualify what we're saying here by saying, this is really just kind of a first cut. This is more illustrative. What we'll show on the map isn't yet an official recommendation. It's not an official proposal. This is really just to kind of start a conversation. It's not necessarily the opinion of the planning staff or the consultant team, let alone SAC-RT. Early next year in January is when we expect to take a first official proposal out. So looking at that first scenario, if there was a new 1/4 cent sales tax in Sacramento County, that would generate $83 million in new revenue in year one. With every succeeding year, those revenues would go up altogether. With inflation and cost escalation, we estimate about $5 billion over 40 years. The projects shown here and that you'll see on the map on the next slide, these are all stated in current year dollars. So this will all add up here to $83 million in the first year. And the first two items there, $30 million each, $60 million total, maintain existing service and state of good repair. Kind of like as discussed in that funding game, this is really what's needed, both to avoid major service reductions and avoid fare increases, as well as to avoid having to do excessive deferment of replacement of our buses, rail cars, maintenance fleet, system, infrastructure, etc. That third item, $2 million for student-free fares, as mentioned, that would continue our existing Ride Free RT program. Right now, we cover a little bit of those costs, but we also get contributions from City of Sacramento and from our school districts. This would basically put that very popular program on permanent footing through a new funding measure. And then that fourth item would contribute $1 million toward new fare discounts for senior, disabled, and/or military service members. I'll be talking a little more about late night service, about coverage and new routes, and about high frequency service on the map. But touching on Glenn's question earlier, this scenario here would set aside $1 million a year for improvements to bus stops and shelters, as well as to additional safety and security improvements. And with that, I'm going to jump to our first map here. So for that quarter-cent measure with $83 million a year, what you see on the screen here, this is kind of the SAC-RT system. The light rail system is shown in purple. Frequent bus routes are shown in red. And if you're thoroughly versed with the SAC-RT system, you probably know that we have two bus routes right now with 15-minute frequent service. So the Route 1 in Citrus Heights and Carmichael, up on Auburn and Greenback, and Route 51 on Broadway and in Stockton. This plan would add 4 more routes to that list, including Route 11 on Truxell Boulevard up to Natomas, Route 30 on J Street out to Sac State, Route 81 on Florin Road and 65th Street, and Route 87 on Howe Avenue. And why these 4 particular routes? Like I mentioned earlier, it's not that SAC-RT staff or consultants feel that these are far and away the 4 best routes. We debated a lot of other strong routes. These routes, for sure, all 4 of them had strong ridership. They had a good competitive cost per passenger, and they all seemed likely to benefit from frequency improvements. We also did take some consideration, kind of geographic separation. We didn't want all the frequent service to be lumped together in one area. When we wanted it to an extent possible to connect, so it could form a little bit of a network. Although you'll see it's a little easier to do that with the half-cent measure, where there's a little more money to spread around. Next on this list here, late night service to 9 new bus routes. They're listed here on the left. On the map where you see the grayish blue, that indicates where we'd add late night bus service. And again, this was super popular with people who participated in the Transit ID Exchange. When we ran numbers on this also appeared to be very cost effective. Routes that would get late night service include Route 1 on Greenback, Route 13 on Arden Way and out to Natomas, routes on El Camino, Fulton, J Street, Stockton and Broadway, in Oak Park on Franklin and MLK, and Route 81 on Florin and 65th Street. And this would be service till 11 p.m., running at least every 30 minutes, weekdays and weekends. And then last on this list here, new service to new areas. First in the Northeast, we have service connecting Citrus Heights over to Folsom, either by way of Greenback or Madison. In Natomas, we have new service in North Natomas west of I-5. New service will be added to Delta Shore 7 days a week, 6 a.m. to 9 p.m. That's been a real common request, something we hear a lot about. And then down in Elk Grove, 3 different bus routes, 3 different existing bus routes in Elk Grove that currently don't have weekend service. We'd be adding weekend service to those. By the numbers, again, of that $83 million, about $60 million of that, about 3/4 of it would basically go to fiscal sustainability, state of good repair, kind of a fix-it-first approach to things. But that would still leave over $20 million for new improvements. These would be modest improvements, but this would still be new service that we think could really benefit the region and that would be popular with our riders. But most of that is devoted to new bus service, a little bit to fares. And I'm going to look to the team here in case we have any questions coming in. The next slide will be on that half-cent measure And the half-cent measure, because there's twice as much money, there are a lot more options with what to do with it and a lot more decisions. So that may actually be one of the more interesting ones to take questions on. But I think one of the takeaways on this quarter-cent measure is, yeah, for a quarter-cent, we wouldn't be able to do every project we want, but we would be able to get some solid improvements. Turning then to the half-cent measure, twice as much new revenue, $165 million in new revenue on year one. Those same two first items would remain the same, $30 million each for existing service, $2 million to make permanent our ride-free program, another $1 million for a new senior disabled and military discount program. First new item on this list, $42 million. This would be to fund a bus rapid transit program, a pretty robust bus rapid transit program of 7 new routes. And I'll talk more about that when we turn to the map. I'll also be talking more about high frequency service, going from 4 to 8 new routes with high frequency, adding at least 1 new route to get some additional coverage in some gap areas. And going, the late night service would go from 9 to 12 new routes. That allocation to bus stops, shelter, safety, and security, that would go from 1 million to 2 million. And last on the list, not to be overlooked, $20 million to do an across-the-board upgrade to the remainder of our bus routes to bring them up to kind of a uniform standard where every bus route would run every 30 minutes, at least every 30 minutes, 7 hours, 7 days a week from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. We call that our 730 network. Taking a look at it on the map, first, the new green lines on the map. These represent bus rapid transit. We've highlighted here bus rapid transit out to the airport. So this would upgrade the existing Route 11. It would extend it all the way to the airport and run it as a bus rapid transit service. So 15-minute headways, not only weekdays, but weekends and late night service, basically rail caliber service, a rail type schedule, but just using a rubber tired bus. We'd have 6 other BRT routes spread out throughout the region on major long distance corridors. That includes Stockton and Broadway, where we currently already have a project underway doing an alternatives analysis. It would include Florin Road and 65th, Route 81. It would include Watt Avenue, Sunrise, Elk Grove, and Arden Way. And kind of our next tier on the list could be that frequent service, those lines in red that we discussed on the previous map. The number of new routes with 15-minute service would go from 4 to 8. So this would add frequent service on Route 23 on El Camino, going out to Sunrise Mall, out to Citrus Heights. We'd have frequent service on the 30 line on J Street, but we'd also add Route 56 on Meadowview, Route 61 on Fruit Ridge. We'd add Route 67 and 68 through Oak Park, all the way down to Cosumnes River College by way of Franklin or MLK. We'd add Route 86 through North Sacramento and Del Paso Heights, and we'd include Route 87 on Howe. And we really think between this and the late night service, this could really be kind of transformative for SAC-RT Transit. You know, this is not even a full cent measure. Down in LA, they have a full cent measure for transit. This is just a half cent. But if you look at our map, this adds frequent service, either in the form of those green BRT lines or those red lines, to a lot of different places. And not to be overlooked, that late night service, this would add a total of 12 routes. So we've got Greenback, Arden Way, out to Natomas, El Camino, Marconi, Fulton, J Street, Meadowview, Fruit Ridge, Franklin, Oak Park on MLK, Del Paso Heights, and Howe, all with late night service. We think this could really bring Sacramento up, maybe not to quite a San Francisco or New York level of service, but you know, a little more like big city transit service where it's easier to get around on the bus 7 days a week, even late nights. Not to be overlooked at all either, that 730 network. The gray lines on the map where it doesn't look like anything's really changed. To be sure, this plan would include $20 million to upgrade all of our core bus routes. That includes Elk Grove, Rancho Cordova, Folsom. All these core routes in gray would get upgraded to every 30 minutes, 7 days a week, 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. And then we have that same new service, those blue lines that we discussed in the last slide, but we'd also add to that Route 2 on Riverside. This is a route we used to run. We cut this back to a commuter-only route, but this would bring this back as an all-day route. And at this point, I want to pause, take any questions again. If you're calling on the phone, *9 to raise your hand. We're happy to take questions by voice or by the text Q&A. But what do you think of the project mix? Do you like it? Would you do something differently? If so, why would you do something differently? Oh, this team here.
You've got one hand from a 310 number.
From a 310. Okay. Number beginning in 310. If you'd like to press *6 to unmute, we're welcome to take your call.
Hi, my name is Farah Mares, and I appreciate this presentation. As a SAC-RT writer, I would like to encourage SAC-RT to prioritize, first of all, making sure that there are no cuts. That should be the first priority. And then after that, I believe late night service and the 7:30 standard to bring all of the all-day bus lines to at least one bus every 30 minutes, 7 days a week. That would make the system substantially more useful to a lot of writers. So I would like to encourage SAC-RT to focus on that, whether SAC-RT ends up doing a 1/4 cent or a 1/2 cent, whether it's a Sacramento City only measure or a countywide measure or a combination of cities. Thank you very much. And also, I think we need to make sure that whatever we pursue is cost effective, whether it's in terms of operating costs or capital costs.
Great question, and that touches upon a couple of our upcoming slides. We've started here with kind of what's out there, and I'll say it again that we haven't wanted to put our finger on the scale too much. One notable thing about this 1/2 cent plan is this notably does not include any new light rail, and I'll go ahead and say that's not necessarily because the consulting team or the planning staff felt that it wasn't competitive. We will be looking in some of the upcoming slides at the cost effectiveness expressed in the terms of the operating cost per passenger. And some of these light rail projects, at least in our initial or preliminary analysis, do appear to be every bit as competitive as some other projects. The main reason we haven't shown any light rail projects on the screen in this scenario really is because the upfront cost to construct light rail, it is quite a bit more, as that cost slide showed. So if we were to put one or more light rail projects on this map, instead of having a number of projects spread out throughout the area, it would be just 1 or 2 projects in 1 or 2 communities. And we kind of thought at this early stage, where our focus has really been more on getting our statistics up, getting our model up and running, that it's maybe a little premature for us to be suggesting or showing on a map that community A or community B ought to get this one major investment. And it might be better just to show a lot of small investments across the board. But again, by no means is that our final recommendation or anything like that. This is more just illustrative of the level of service we might be able to afford.
You got a hand up from Glenn Mandelkern.
Glenn, question. Go ahead, sir.
Yeah.
We can hear you now, Glenn. Thank you.
Hello.
Yeah, go ahead.
Great. Oh, okay. So, all right. So I'm definitely excited by what you've presented here. I see some of my wishes represented here, especially like the Citrus Heights to Folsom direct connection. So I'm grateful for that. There's a lot of things to like here for sure. I am thinking about one thing though, that maybe a few years ago when similar topics were brought up, I remember one route that people wanted to see more frequency and possibly more late night service also was on 82. I think it was
Mhm.
mostly due to community colleges that it serves, and and also different like Kaiser in between. It seems like 82 serves a lot of places, and also 82 is a route that can connect to many other routes. So I was wondering why 82 doesn't appear here, or would you consider adding it to your list of choices here?
So Route 82, for those of you who don't know, it goes from University 65th Street, Sac State, all the way out to American River College. And this was one that was very much a consideration. I think this is one where it could have been Route 82 or any of a number of other nearby routes. We have a lot of similarly strong performers in that area. The 26 on Fulton, the 84 on Watt. The 82 has pretty strong ridership, especially on weekdays, especially during the school year. During the summer and on weekends, it does tend to drop off a little bit. So that may have been a little bit of a difference maker for us. And then I think some of it just was because we already had a number of other routes in this area that were poised to get upgrades. We kind of thought we can't necessarily do them all. But I would go ahead and concede that, reasonable people could disagree. There's definitely a case that maybe the 82 should have been on this list instead of one of these other routes, because it is similarly a pretty strong performer. One thing I'll also add while we're paused here is it's great to hear positive feedback on these scenarios. It's been enjoyable for our staff to see what could be possible. But for sure, part of this project, part of our COA and our long range plan is going to also necessarily have to be taking a look at a worst case scenario. If we don't get any new transit funding here in Sacramento, this is something we talked about at the last COA presentation, but if we don't get any new transit funding, we may be able to get by for a few years. We may be able to defer maintenance on fleet and system and spend some of that money to cover our bills on operating cost. But that's not something we can do in perpetuity. So part of this project will definitely be doing scenario planning for a worst case scenario where we may have to do some major service reductions and fare increases. It looks like we're done with questions. Okay, I'm going to jump now. We're going to get back a little bit. You've already seen this slide on project cost, but we may refer back to this. Just as a refresher, we've got light rail projects, bus rapid transit projects, and we didn't talk too much about the plain old bus projects, but just as some examples here, the late night service altogether comes out to about 300 million, and it's basically almost strictly an operating cost. There's not really a capital cost for fleet because we'd just be taking the buses we have and running them later at night. For frequent service, upgrades to those 8 routes, it's 1.2 billion over 40 years. There is a capital cost associated with it, but it's really a pretty small fraction. That's that cost to buy new buses. And it's really pretty similar for the 730 network. There is actually, on this slide, we're missing the capital cost element for that 730 network, but I know it's pretty similar to that frequent grid. It's pretty small. And it also almost misses, it almost becomes obscure, but Ride-Free RT, we'll get into this a little more when we get into cost effectiveness too, but there is a cost for it, but it's really pretty small cost. And of course, there's no capital cost. This next slide, this is a first look at potential ridership from some of these initiatives. And right off the bat, I'm going to preface this remarks by noting that these are all unofficial statistics. These are subject to change. We've wanted to get some basic numbers together. It's kind of a rough order of magnitude so that we can begin to start doing some comparisons from one project to another on cost effectiveness and cost per passenger. But ridership estimation is always an inexact science, even in the best case scenario. And the methodology for these, there's some variation in methodology. In some cases, we have ridership numbers that were put together through use of a computerized model. with the assistance of consultant or with the assistance of SACOG. But some of those may be a little old, and some of those may be for slightly different project definitions. The route may be a slightly different route. There may be a different number of stations. Some of these may have no ridership number at all that was ever made as part of a formal model, but where we just used kind of industry standard methods for benchmarking and making projections. I'll use Stockton BRT as an example. Many of you know Route 51 on Stockton Broadway. Stockton BRT on here is shown as, of all these new initiatives, the lowest ridership initiative. But there's an important note on that. What you're seeing here, this chart presents the net new passengers per year. So this is not total riders on any of these lines. This represents the increase in ridership from that new service. And as many of you may know, if you ride Route 51 on Stockton and Broadway, that's a route, it's already our strongest ridership route in the system, and it already has frequent headways. Because it's already every 15 minutes for 13 hours of the day, we'd really only need to improve the headways for 1 additional hour. And so if we go back to the project cost for Stockton BRT, you'll see that light green area is just a sliver, because it really wouldn't cost that much to bring it up to bus rapid transit standards. But at the same time, that means the ridership gain, the net ridership gain, is not necessarily going to be as large as on some of our other projects. To use another example, the ridership on Truxell BRT. This is essentially upgrading Route 11, our current route up to North Natomas. It's upgrading it to bus rapid transit standards. Right now it runs 30-minute headways during the morning, 45-minute headways off peak, and it only runs to Natomas. This Truxell BRT, if you remember from the map, this would go all the way out to the airport. So it's a longer line and it's frequent service. But this ridership number is still net of the existing ridership on Route 11. Those ridership numbers being said, I'm going to turn next to our cost effectiveness. This is our cost per passenger here in blue. So in this slide, we've looked at that operating cost, that light green section for those services, and we've divided that by our gain in ridership. And this is really a measure of cost effectiveness. What's your bang for the buck? And you won't see dollar numbers on here, and that's intentional. We've wanted to keep this fairly nondescript, only because these numbers are pretty preliminary. But we have gone ahead and marked on here that vertical line in blue, that broken line. That's the $8 per passenger mark, and existing bus service averages about $8 per passenger. That's our existing operating cost per passenger. So one of the first things we noticed when we started taking that preliminary ridership and putting it over that operating cost is that most of these projects do end up being higher cost per passenger than our existing service. And that's actually not a surprising result. And that's really because, you know, all the places where there's the greatest ridership potential, whether it's downtown Sacramento or South Sacramento, we tend to already have service there. Where we'd be adding service tends to be augmenting existing routes or putting service in new areas where we don't already have it. And so that typically is not going to be as cost effective as the service we have out there. But there are a couple notable examples here. On account of a pretty strong ridership forecast, bus rapid transit out to the airport does look pretty favorable here. And down in the lower area, that late night service, which was very popular at the Transit ID Exchange, that's also appeared to be very cost effective. We could possibly lower our cost per passenger by adding some evening service. We think that's especially attractive if we could do it on a lot of routes where you start to get that network effect. Another thing we noticed is there is probably more variation within one mode, basically from route to route, than there is between modes. In other words, our bus rapid transit, the cost per passenger ranges from the low end up to the high end. And on our light rail, we see the same thing. So when we said earlier that there's some pretty competitive light rail projects. When we modeled out light rail just out to Natomas, it looked pretty attractive from a cost per passenger standpoint. But if you turn back to the total project costs, it is a big ticket item. And keep in mind that line item number 2, this is 4 miles just from Richards Boulevard to Arena Boulevard. The full airport line is 11 miles. So that's 4 miles to Natomas and another 7 miles to go the rest of the way to the airport. That construction cost altogether is 0.8 plus 1.5. That's 2.3 billion. And if you recall, a quarter-cent sales tax would generate only 5 billion over 40 years. So merely being able to afford that light rail, that would consume a considerable part of that measure. As you noted before, though, you usually can get a large fraction of projects like that paid for by other grants. That 2.3 billion, you usually wouldn't pay for that straight out of the new measure. You'd usually get, we figure we probably could get at least 50% of those costs paid for through other state, local, and federal grants. The other thing to mention is, some of these projects, you may live in one of these communities and say, well, gee, how come my route doesn't look so hot? The response to that first is, like I said, these ridership numbers, there's always some margin of error. And this is really a first look. And the other thing where there could be some margin of error is on the cost. And that can especially be the case with Bus Rapid Transit. I'll turn again back to that green slide. For Bus Rapid Transit, you see quite a variation here in project costs. There's kind of a bunching, these bottom 5. But Elk Grove and Truxell tend to be a little more expensive. Bus Rapid Transit can have a pretty wide variation in cost. It's common to see side running Bus Rapid Transit being built for about $4 million per mile, whereas Bus Rapid Transit built in the median of a roadway can be 10 times that. It can be $50 million per mile to construct, and it can be even more if built in a private right-of-way, basically like a light rail line. So the higher project cost here for Truxell BRT, that represents a line where there would be more private right-of-way and more median operation. The Elk Grove Bus Rapid Transit also assumes kind of a mix with a little more median operation, whereas these last 5, these assume kind of an 80-20 mix between construction in the median of the road versus being built on a side running lane. It could be a bus lane or it could be mixed flow, but either way, side running tends to be lower cost. So there can be quite a variation in cost just based on how these projects are defined. This cost per passenger, we mentioned that capital costs can be picked up by grants. It's also true that operating cost can be picked up through partners. In all our assumptions, we've always assumed that this light green operating cost is paid for 100% out of this new measure. We want to assume fiscal sustainability. But for some of these projects where the operating cost per passenger does look on the high end, it's not out of the picture that we couldn't work up an agreement with one of our partner jurisdictions to help make a contribution to that operating cost, because what we really care about as SAC-RT is the net operating cost. So a contribution there to cover that operating cost could help make some of these projects a little more competitive. At this point, I want to pause again, open it up for questions, and I'm going to pose a couple discussion questions. First, do any of these draft performance results, are any of these particularly surprising to you? And second, after having seen some of these results, does this change what your preference might be in the half-cent plan? And I'm not seeing any questions in the chat yet. If there are any questions, feel free to raise your hand. Again, if you're on the phone, *9 will raise your hand and we'll call on you to go *6 to speak. Thus far, it looks like no questions, so I'm going to jump to last couple slides here. Thus far, we've talked about project evaluation, and we've really kind of focused on cost per passenger, and really just on operating cost per passenger. Internally, we have already taken a look at our capital cost per passenger, dividing that up over the useful life of a project. But what we're really trying to get at here is a comprehensive way to evaluate these projects. There's always a lot of focus on the money side of things and on ridership. That's always the first question that's asked. But we want to make sure that that's not the only question or the only basis on which we're evaluating these projects. So that second bullet point on here we highlighted was deliverability. We touched on this a little before, that you know, a project that can be delivered with certainty in 1 or 2 years, there is some value to that compared to a project that might take 8 or 9 years. Bus rapid transit projects, it's common for those to take more than 6 years between environmental analysis, alternatives analysis, engineering design, and then acquisition of right-of-way, utility relocation, to say nothing of construction. So, you know, one thing we'd like to look at for our stakeholders is how quickly we can turn around delivery of a project and get it out there on the street. So in a nutshell, deliverability could kind of be quantified in, well, how many years is it likely to take to deliver this project? That third bullet point, equity, that's always something that's foremost in our minds. Here in the transit business, we are kind of in the fortunate situation in that typically when our projects are cost effective, when they have a good operating cost per passenger, when they have a lot of passengers per vehicle hour, that typically tends to correlate with equity, with our equity goals. We tend to find that disadvantaged communities tend to make greater use of transit. So when we're putting routes out in places where they get used, it typically tends to correlate with our equity goals of helping disadvantaged populations. But at the same time, it's not necessarily synonymous. So we wanted to put in an extra 10% here to kind of give some bonus points to potential projects where maybe the cost effectiveness isn't as good as we thought, but we know it would help a disadvantaged community. And then last, that last 20%, this is kind of a miscellaneous item here. And we really came about this when we were discussing reliability projects and on-time performance projects. I'll use the Gold Line as an example. We have projects in our engineering department to increase double tracking out on the Gold Line, which would help with our on-time performance, help with our reliability. How many passengers would we gain from that? It's not something that's easily quantified the same way as a new service is, but we know it would be good. So we set out to have an allocation in our scoring that would take into account reliability. And that's just one example. In this list, we also mentioned safety and security. And we also mentioned comfort and accessibility, which would basically be a way to measure the value of those improved bus stops and shelters that we've heard about at most of our meetings, including tonight. So this is kind of our first stab at a way to kind of numerically score our project list. We'd like to know what else you'd like to see. Are there any other metrics or analyses that you think would make sense to see in here? Or how important is that weighting? How important should ridership or cost effectiveness be compared to other considerations? That's a question we'll open up here to the chat. And that'll bring us shortly to our wrap up here. We'll look ahead to future meetings. You have any incoming questions? All right. So as mentioned before, this is kind of a first look at kind of affordability, how many total projects we could fit in a plan at different funding levels. We've sought to use some funding levels that we think are as realistic as possible. This COA project, certainly pursuing a funding measure, that's not something that's part of our project. Our job here in planning is really more just to be prepared. If there were to be a new funding measure in one of these amounts, what could we do with it? Part of our job is also to be visionary. That half-cent funding measure, That's frankly more than has ever been put on the ballot. There's been ballot measures run in 2016 and 2022, and they were always more akin to the quarter-cent measure. But we've wanted to be somewhat visionary here to show our stakeholders what we could do with a little more money. We all know what it's like to see that even places like LA have gotten huge chunks of money, and we can't make it happen here, but we've seen it partly as our job here in planning to be visionary and show our community what could happen if we were to get something like that. But as mentioned, this is kind of a first cut. Our official plan, our first official draft, we expect to actually publish after the first of the year. And that, of course, will be a draft for public review. We'll put it out for at least 30 days. We'll do a full round then of public engagement. And then we'd like to bring a final long-range plan to the SAC-RT board for approval late winter or early spring. After that long-range plan is concluded, that's when we'll be turning back to that short-range plan. As mentioned, with that long-range plan, some of the work that will happen between now and January will include looking at that worst-case scenario, what we might have to do if there is no new funding on the horizon for SAC-RT. So that may not be as enjoyable of an exercise, but something we have to do. You guys are here tonight, obviously, for our webinar, and thank you, everyone, for joining in. If you'd like to catch us in person, or if you missed part of this presentation, or if you know others who'd like to be here in person, we'll be back out the evening of Tuesday, November 18th. We'll be at SAC-RT headquarters at 1102 Q Street. And if afternoons are better for you, we won't be doing the full presentation, but we will be doing a brief 15-minute presentation to our Mobility Advisory Council the afternoon of Thursday, November 20th. There'll be an opportunity for members of the public to ask questions there as well. And of course, sacrt.com/COA is our home for this project. You can find information there, and you can also send me an email, which either me or one of the members of our project team will get to. I'm going to look to the team one more. No more questions pending. I'll hold here for a little bit, but barring any new questions coming in, I'll thank everyone for joining in. Appreciate getting some attention to this project. This has been recorded, so this will be posted online if you want to check back or share this with others. Thank you, everyone, once again, for your time and attention.